I'm Esther Wong, 68, and I've spent 3 decades building a successful vintage clothing boutique from nothing after immigrating to America. At my granddaughter Emma's 16th birthday party last weekend, she looked at my carefully chosen outfit and announced to her friends that I was so cringe and embarrassing. The laughter that followed cut deeper than any business rejection ever had. But what Emma didn't know was that her trust fund, the one funding her designer lifestyle, came from selling the very cringe clothes she mocked. Sometimes the most powerful lessons come wrapped in the uncomfortable truth about gratitude and respect. Before we jump back in, tell me where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. If you've ever felt dismissed by younger family members who don't understand your journey, like this video. The jade brooch had been my mother's, and her mother's before that. I touched it gently as I sat in my living room that night, the party's echoes still ringing in my ears. The worn edges of my immigration documents caught my eye from the photo album on the coffee table. Those precious papers that had changed everything 39 years ago. Was 31 when I stepped off the plane at LAX in 1985, clutching a single suitcase and exactly $200 in cash. The America I'd dreamed of in Guangzhou seemed impossibly vast and foreign. Everything moved so fast, the cars, the people, the language that tumbled around me like rushing water I couldn't quite catch. That my English was basic then, learned from books and a few conversation classes. Excuse me, thank you, where is Bother? These phrases felt clumsy in my mouth, nothing like the fluid Cantonese that had carried my thoughts for 3 decades. But I had come here with purpose, carrying the dreams of my parents who had saved every yuan to send me to this land of opportunity. The first months were brutal. I worked at a dim sum restaurant in Chinatown, my hands raw from washing dishes in scalding water, my feet aching from 12-hour shifts. The other workers spoke Cantonese, which was a comfort. But the customers, they spoke English that moved too fast for my textbook vocabulary. I memorized phrases. More tea. Check, please. Have nice day. At night, I studied English television programs, writing down words I didn't understand. I watched soap operas and game shows, trying to understand the rhythm of American speech. The apartment I shared with 3 other women was tiny, but it was mine in a way nothing had ever been in China. Here, I could dream as big as I dared. That's when I found my first vintage dress. I was walking through a neighborhood outside Chinatown, practicing my English by reading store signs, when I spotted a small thrift shop. In the window hung a 1950s party dress, the kind worn by movie stars in the films I'd watched as a child. The fabric was silk, the color a deep emerald that reminded me of jade. It was $25 more than I should have spent, but something about it called to me. I bought it, took it home, and studied every seam, every detail. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. In China, I had learned to sew from my grandmother, and I recognized quality when I saw it. This dress was worth far more than $25 to the right person. The next weekend, I wore it to a small community event. A woman approached me immediately. "Where did you get that dress?" she asked, her eyes wide with admiration. "It's gorgeous. I find in shop," I said carefully, my English still halting. "Would you ever sell it? I collect vintage pieces." She offered me $80 on the spot. I was stunned. In one transaction, I had made more than I earned in 2 days at the restaurant. That night, I couldn't sleep. I had discovered something remarkable. Americans valued their past, their vintage clothing, in ways I was only beginning to understand. I started visiting thrift stores and estate sales every weekend, learning to spot quality pieces that others overlooked. My small section of the shared apartment became a treasure trove of vintage finds. I sold pieces to coworkers, to customers at the restaurant, to anyone who would listen to my broken English descriptions of the beautiful clothes I'd found. Within 6 months, I was making as much from vintage clothing as I was from the restaurant. Within a year, I had saved enough to rent my own small apartment. The immigration documents that had seemed so intimidating when I first arrived now felt like a key to something I'd never imagined possible. The business license still hangs in my office, though it's faded now and the edges are worn from handling. I remember the day I received it, October 15, 1987, like it was yesterday. Esther's Vintage Treasures was officially a real business, not just a dream I carried in my heart. Getting that license had been harder than I expected. The paperwork was overwhelming, filled with legal terms my English classes had never covered. I spent hours at the library, looking up words in my Chinese-English dictionary, trying to understand concepts like business classification and tax identification numbers. The clerk at the city office spoke quickly, impatiently, as if my careful pronunciation of each word was a personal inconvenience, but I persevered. I had learned that in America, paperwork was power. Documents made things real, made them official. That folded piece of paper represented something my parents could never have imagined their daughter. Owning a business in the United States, I started small, selling from my apartment on weekends. Word spread through the Chinese community first, then beyond. Mrs. Chen from the grocery store told her daughter, who told her friend, who told her coworker. Soon, I had customers calling me during the week, asking if I had found anything new. My apartment became a showroom. I organized clothes by era and style, creating little vignettes that told stories. A 1960s mod dress hung next to period accessories. A 1940s suit was paired with vintage shoes and a hat. I learned that Americans didn't just buy clothes, they bought stories, memories, connections to a past they romanticized. The breakthrough came when I found a 1950s Christian Dior suit at an estate sale in Beverly Hills. The elderly woman selling it had no idea what she had. "It's just old," she said dismissively. "Take it for $10. I nearly fainted. The suit was authentic, the label clear, the construction impeccable. I spent 2 weeks researching its value, visiting libraries, and talking to other vintage sellers. When I finally put it up for sale, a collector from New York flew to Los Angeles just to see it. She paid me $1,500 without hesitation. That sale changed everything. I realized I wasn't just selling clothes, I was a curator of fashion history, a bridge between past and present. I began studying fashion magazines from different eras, learning about designers and their signatures, understanding what made certain pieces valuable. My English improved rapidly out of necessity. I had to describe fabric, cut, condition, provenance. I learned words like pristine, provenance, bespoke. My customers appreciated my knowledge, and soon I was known not just as a seller, but as an expert. The Chinese work ethic my parents had instilled in me served me well. I worked 7 days a week, hunting for pieces on weekends, researching and selling during the week. Every spare dollar went back into inventory. I ate simple meals, wore the same few outfits, lived as frugally as possible. The business was my baby, and I nurtured it with the same devotion I would later give to my family. By 1989, I had outgrown my apartment. I found a small storefront in a modest shopping district, nothing fancy but clean and well lit. The rent was steep, more than I made in a month at the restaurant, but I had saved enough to cover 6 months. It was a leap of faith that terrified and exhilarated me in equal measure. The day I hung my first open sign, I stood in my empty shop and cried. Not from sadness, but from overwhelming gratitude. In 4 years, I had gone from washing dishes to owning a business. The American dream my parents had sacrificed for was becoming real, one vintage dress at a time. The first customer was a teenage girl looking for a prom dress. She tried on a 1960s cocktail dress that fit her perfectly, the coral color bringing out her eyes. When she saw herself in the mirror, she gasped. "I looked like a movie star," she whispered. "You look like yourself," I told her, "but the most beautiful version." She bought the dress, and I made my first sale in my very own shop. That night, I called my parents in China and told them about my store. My mother cried. My father was proud but worried about the risks. "Be careful," he said. "Don't take chances." But I was already taking the biggest chance of my life, and it was paying off beautifully. The framed photograph from my grand opening still makes me smile. There I am, 35 years old, standing proudly in front of Esther's vintage treasures, with a red ribbon in my hands and the biggest grin you've ever seen. My hair was still completely black then, pulled back in a neat bun, and I wore a 1950s dress that had been my first major find, the emerald silk one that started it all. The 1990s were magical for vintage clothing. Suddenly, everyone wanted to own a piece of fashion history. Movies like Pretty Woman and The Bodyguard made vintage glamour fashionable again. Young women wanted to look like the stars of Hollywood's golden age, and I had exactly what they needed. My little shop became a destination. Fashion students from local colleges would spend hours browsing my carefully curated collections. Costume designers for television shows became regular customers. I remember the day a woman came in looking for 1960s pieces for a period drama. She ended up buying 12 outfits and invited me to the set to see how they looked on camera. The business grew beyond my wildest dreams. I moved to a larger location on Melrose Avenue, the heart of Los Angeles vintage scene. The new shop was 3 times bigger, with enough space to display my growing collection properly. I hired my first employee, a young fashion student named Jennifer, who shared my passion for vintage pieces. Those were the days when I felt most alive. I would wake up at dawn, excited to open the shop and see what customers would discover. Each piece had a story, and I became a storyteller. The 1940s wedding dress that had survived the war. The 1970s designer coat that had belonged to a famous actress. The 1920s beaded flapper dress that had danced through the jazz age. Celebrities started finding me. A famous actress bought a 1960s Halston dress for a red carpet event. A rock star's wife became a regular customer, buying vintage band t-shirts and leather jackets. Word spread through Hollywood that Esther Wong had the best vintage collection in the city. I remember the day Julia Roberts' stylist came in. She was preparing for a movie premiere and needed something special. I showed her a 1950s Dior gown, black silk with intricate beadwork. When Julia tried it on, she looked like a goddess. The dress made headlines the next day, and suddenly I had customers calling from around the world. The money was good, better than I had ever imagined possible. I was able to move to a nice apartment, buy a reliable car, and start saving for the future. But more than the money, I felt respected. Fashion magazines interviewed me about vintage trends. I was invited to speak at fashion schools. The broken English I had once been ashamed of became part of my charm. Customers loved my stories told in my careful, measured way. It was during this golden period that I met Robert. He was a customer, actually, looking for a vintage suit for his law firm's anniversary party. He was 15 years older than me, recently divorced, with a 10-year-old daughter named Lisa. He was kind and patient, listening to my stories about the clothes without rushing to make a purchase. "You really love what you do," he said, after I'd spent 20 minutes explaining the history of a 1940s zoot suit. "Yes," I said simply. "I love bringing beauty back to life." He bought the suit, but more importantly, he asked if I would like to have dinner with him. I said yes, surprising myself. I had been so focused on the business that I hadn't made time for romance. Robert was everything I hadn't known I needed. He was stable, successful, and completely supportive of my work. He understood that my shop was more than a business, was my art, my contribution to the world. When we married in 1995, he walked me down the aisle in a 1950s wedding dress that I had been saving for the right moment. Lisa, his daughter, was hesitant about me at first. She was a teenager, dealing with her parents' divorce and now her father's remarriage. But gradually, she warmed to me. I taught her about fashion history, showed her how to spot quality pieces, shared my love of beautiful things. She started spending weekends at the shop, helping customers and learning the business. By the late 1990s, I was doing better than I had ever dreamed. I owned my home, had a loving husband, and was helping raise a daughter who was becoming like my own. The business was thriving, and I was respected in my community. I had achieved the American dream, and I was grateful every single day. When I started thinking about the future, about legacy, Lisa was growing up, and I wanted to ensure that she would always be taken care of. I set up a trust fund for her, and later, when she had Emma, I expanded it to include my granddaughter. I wanted to give them the security I had never had growing up, the freedom to pursue their dreams without worrying about money. I never imagined that generosity would one day become the source of such heartbreak. The traditional Chinese dress hangs in my closet still, wrapped in tissue paper like a memory I can't quite let go. It's a qipao, deep red silk with golden dragons embroidered along the hem, the kind of dress that makes you stand taller when you wear it. I bought it for Emma when she was 12, thinking she might wear it to Chinese New Year celebrations or cultural events at school. She loved it then. I remember her spinning in front of the mirror, the silk fabric flowing around her like liquid fire. "I look like a princess, Nai Nai," she said, using the Chinese word for grandmother that I had taught her, "like the ladies in your old photographs." "You look like a Chinese princess," I corrected gently. "You look like who you are." But that was before she became a teenager, before she decided that anything connected to her Chinese heritage was embarrassing. The transformation was gradual, so subtle that I didn't notice it at first. She stopped asking me to teach her Mandarin phrases. She stopped wanting to help me cook traditional dishes. She stopped calling me Nai Nai. Just call me Grandma, she said one day when she was 14. Nai Nai sounds weird. The word stung more than I expected. That name had connected us to something bigger than ourselves, 2 generations of women who had come before us. But I swallowed my hurt and said, "Okay, Emma, whatever makes you comfortable." Lisa, Emma's mother, didn't help matters. She had grown up American, attending American schools, dating American boys. She appreciated the financial stability my business provided, but she never fully embraced the cultural aspects of our family. When she married David, a nice man but very American, I watched as Emma moved further away from her Chinese roots. The tension came to a head during Emma's freshman year of high school. The school was celebrating International Culture Day, and I offered to help Emma create a presentation about Chinese traditions. I was excited finally, a chance to share our heritage with her classmates. "I don't want to do China," Emma said flatly. "It's boring. All the Asian kids do China or Korea or whatever. I want to do something different." "But it's your heritage," I said carefully. "It's part of who you are." "No, it's not," she snapped. "I'm American. I was born here. I don't speak Chinese. I don't know anything about China except what you tell me, and honestly, I don't really care." The words hit me like a physical blow. I had spent years trying to pass on our culture, our history, our traditions. I had told her stories about her great-grandparents, about the struggles and triumphs of our family. I had tried to teach her that being Chinese American didn't mean choosing one over the other. It meant being blessed with both. But Emma saw only the differences, only the things that made her stand out when she wanted to blend in. She was embarrassed by the way I spoke, by my careful English with its slight accent. She was embarrassed by the traditional foods I cooked, by the way I dressed, by the cultural celebrations I wanted to share with her. The kippah became a symbol of our growing divide. I had hoped she would wear it to her school's spring formal, but she chose a modern dress instead, something trendy and American. "The Chinese dress is too much," she said, not meeting my eyes. I started to notice other changes too. When her friends came over, Emma would steer them away from the parts of the house where I displayed Chinese art and photographs. She would introduce me quickly and then usher them to her room. She stopped bringing friends to the shop, stopped talking about her grandmother who owned a vintage clothing store. "You're being dramatic," Lisa said when I expressed my concerns. "She's just a teenager. They're embarrassed by everything." But I knew it was more than typical teenage embarrassment. Emma was actively rejecting the part of herself that connected to me, to our family history, to the sacrifices that had made her comfortable life possible. She saw my Chinese heritage as something to be ashamed of, not something to be proud of. I tried different approaches. I offered to take her to China to meet relatives, to see where our family came from. She wasn't interested. I suggested we cook Chinese meals together, like I had done with her mother. She preferred takeout pizza. I bought her books about Chinese American history, thinking she might connect with stories of people who had navigated the same cultural bridge. She never read them. The breaking point came at her 15th birthday party. I had given her a beautiful piece of jade jewelry, a delicate necklace that had belonged to my grandmother. In Chinese culture, jade is precious, protective, meaningful. I had saved it for years, waiting for the right moment to pass it down. Emma opened the box, looked at the necklace, and said, "Oh, thanks, Grandma. It's very traditional." She put it aside and moved on to the next gift without another word. I watched her unwrap expensive electronics, designer clothes, trendy accessories, all things that money could buy, but that carried no history, no meaning, no connection to who she was. That night, I found the jade necklace in the box, forgotten on her dresser. I picked it up, feeling the weight of generations in my hands, and wondered where I had gone wrong. How had I failed to pass on the understanding that we were more than just individuals, that we were part of a story that stretched back hundreds of years? I realized then that Emma didn't see me as her grandmother who had built a successful business from nothing. She didn't see me as a woman who had crossed an ocean to give her family a better life. She saw me as an embarrassment, a reminder of otherness in a world where she desperately wanted to belong. The kippah still hangs in my closet, waiting for a granddaughter who will never wear it, representing everything I had hoped to pass down. But couldn't. The bank statement arrived on a Tuesday morning, as it did every month. showing the automatic transfer of $3,000 into Emma's account. I stared at the numbers, remembering when I used to make that amount in 6 months at the dim sum restaurant. Now it was Emma's monthly allowance, money she spent without a second thought, on things that would have seemed impossible luxuries to me at her age. I had set up the trust fund with the best intentions. I wanted Emma to have opportunities I never had, to pursue her dreams without the constant worry about money that had driven every decision of my early life in America. I wanted her to focus on her education, her passions, her future, not on working multiple jobs just to survive. But somewhere along the way, my gift of security had become her expectation of entitlement. Emma's bedroom looked like a high-end boutique. Designer handbags lined the shelves, Gucci, Prada, Louis Vuitton, each one costing more than most people made in a month. Her closet was packed with clothes that still had tags on them, impulse purchases that she wore once or never. Shoes were scattered across the floor, expensive heels and sneakers mixing together in careless abundance. Her social media accounts told the story of a life funded by money she had never earned. Photos of expensive dinners at trendy restaurants, weekend trips to Napa Valley and Las Vegas, shopping sprees at Beverly Hills boutiques. Her friends called her generous, always picking up the check, always suggesting the most expensive options for their activities. Emma's treat had become her signature phrase, as if the money materialized from thin air rather than from the careful work of selling vintage clothing to customers who appreciated craftsmanship and history. I watched her friends, a group of equally privileged teenagers who had never known financial struggle. They spoke casually about spring break trips to Europe, about cars their parents bought them for their 16th birthdays, about college applications where the main concern was whether the school had the right social scene. Money was never a consideration, it was simply assumed to be available. At family dinners, Emma would complain about things that revealed how disconnected she had become from reality. The Tesla is being serviced, so I have to drive Mom's BMW. It's so embarrassing, she said one Sunday, completely serious. I thought about my first car, a 15-year-old Honda that I had saved for 2 years to buy, treating it like the precious gift it was. She talked about her friends' problems with the detached concern of someone who had never faced real difficulties. Madison is so stressed about her sweet 16. Her parents are only giving her $20,000 for the party. Can you believe how cheap they are? I couldn't believe it, but not in the way Emma intended. The worst part was watching how the money had changed her relationship with effort and achievement. When she wanted something, she simply bought it. When she was bored, she went shopping. When her friends suggested activities, price was never a factor in her decision-making process. She had stopped working for things, stopped appreciating things, stopped understanding the connection between effort and reward. The jade necklace I had given her, a family heirloom, worth thousands of dollars in sentimental value, set, forgotten in her jewelry box while she wore mass-produced pieces that cost more but meant nothing. I had tried to talk to Lisa about my concerns, but she enjoyed the benefits of Emma's trust fund too. When Emma picked up expensive restaurant tabs, Lisa didn't have to. When Emma bought gifts for the family, Lisa felt generous by proxy. The money I had earned through decades of hard work had created a bubble of privilege that insulated my family from the realities most people faced. Emma's friends knew her as the generous one, the one with unlimited resources, but I wondered what they would think if they knew the source of her wealth: vintage clothing sold by her immigrant grandmother. The same clothes Emma now mocked as outdated and embarrassing. The monthly bank statements became a source of growing frustration for me. $3,000 that could have helped so many people, that represented hundreds of hours of my work, that came from the sale of beautiful, historical pieces that I had carefully curated and lovingly restored. And Emma spent it on things she forgot about within days. I had wanted to give her freedom, but I had accidentally given her imprisonment, the prison of never learning her own strength, never discovering what she was capable of achieving on her own, never understanding the satisfaction that comes from earning something through your own effort. That the trust fund that was meant to be a blessing had become a curse, creating a granddaughter who saw money as limitless and effort as optional. She had become exactly what I had never wanted her to be: someone who took without giving, who consumed without creating, who lived without understanding the cost. Every month, when I signed the authorization for her allowance, I felt a little more like I was funding my own heartbreak. The money I had earned through respect for beautiful, meaningful things was being spent by someone who respected nothing but the latest trends and the approval of people, who valued her only for what she could buy them. I had tried to give Emma the world, but in doing so, I had failed to teach her how to value it. The invitation to Emma's Sweet 16 arrived in my mailbox 3 weeks before the party, delivered in a heavy envelope with her initials embossed in gold. The invitation itself was a work of art professionally designed, printed on thick cardstock with elegant typography, and a photo of Emma looking like a young Hollywood starlet. The cost of printing alone probably exceeded what I had spent on my wedding invitations. Black tie optional, it read, "Join us for an evening of elegance and celebration." I studied the invitation, marveling at its sophistication and expense. Emma had planned this party like a corporate event, complete with a professional event planner, hired photographers, and a catered dinner for 50 guests. The venue was an upscale hotel ballroom, the kind of place where I had once sold vintage dresses to wealthy customers for special occasions. For weeks, I debated what to wear. This was my granddaughter's milestone birthday, and I wanted to look special, to show her how much the occasion meant to me. I considered buying something new, but that felt wrong somehow. I was a vintage clothing expert early. I owned something perfect for such an important event. I spent hours going through my personal collection, pieces I had kept over the years because they were too beautiful to sell or too meaningful to part with. There was the 1960s Chanel suit I had worn to my first fashion industry event, the 1950s cocktail dress I had found at an estate sale in Beverly Hills, the 1940s evening gown that had belonged to a silent film actress. But when I saw the jade brooch, I knew immediately what I would wear. The brooch had been my mother's most precious possession, given to her by her own mother on her wedding day. It was carved jade, deep green and smooth, depicting a traditional Chinese phoenix, the symbol of grace, virtue, and prosperity. My mother had worn it on special occasions throughout her life, and she had given it to me the day I left China for America. "Wear this when you need to remember who you are," she had said, pinning it carefully to my jacket. "Wear this when you need strength." I had worn it to my naturalization ceremony, to my wedding, to the opening of my first shop. It had been with me through every important moment of my American life, a tangible connection to my heritage and my family's sacrifices. For Emma's party, I chose a simple but elegant black dress, classic and timeless, the kind of piece that would never go out of style. The jade brooch would be the perfect accent, beautiful, meaningful, and appropriately formal for the occasion. I imagined Emma noticing it, asking about its history, giving me the chance to share another piece of our family story. I spent extra time on my appearance that evening. I had my hair done at the salon, choosing an elegant updo that would showcase the brooch. I selected my best shoes, a vintage pair from the 1960s that I had kept in perfect condition. My makeup was careful and subtle, appropriate for a grandmother but still polished and refined. As I pinned the jade brooch to my dress, I thought about all the women in my family who had worn it before me. My great-grandmother, who had survived wars and famines. My grandmother, who had raised 6 children through poverty and hardship. My mother, who had worked in factories to save money for my passage to America. Each of them had worn this brooch with pride, understanding that it represented not just beauty but resilience, not just tradition but strength. I arrived at the hotel ballroom feeling confident and appropriately dressed. The venue was stunning. Ma had chosen well. Soft lighting created an elegant atmosphere, and the decorations were tasteful and sophisticated. This was clearly a party planned by someone with excellent taste and unlimited resources. The other guests were already arriving, and I was impressed by how grown-up Emma's friends looked. The girls wore designer dresses that probably cost more than most people's monthly salaries, and the boys were dressed in suits that had clearly been tailored specifically for them. These were children who had never known financial constraint, who considered expensive clothing as natural as breathing. I found Emma near the entrance, greeting guests with the poise of someone much older. She looked beautiful. Her dress was a stunning creation in pale pink silk, her hair and makeup professionally done. She was every inch the princess she had always been told she was. "Happy birthday, darling," I said, approaching her with a smile, and the beautifully wrapped gift I had chosen, a vintage Cartier watch that had belonged to a 1940s film star. Emma hugged me politely, the kind of hug you give to an obligation rather than someone you love. "Thanks for coming, Grandma," she said, already looking past me to the next guests arriving. I was about to compliment her dress, to tell her how beautiful she looked, when I noticed her eyes focus on my brooch. For a moment, I thought she was admiring it, and I prepared to tell her its story. Instead, her expression shifted to something I had never seen before, look of embarrassment mixed with disdain. She glanced around quickly, checking to see if any of her friends had noticed her grandmother's outdated accessory. That look should have warned me what was coming, but I was still living in the fantasy that this was my beloved granddaughter, the girl who had once spun in the red kipao and called me Nai Nai. I was still believing that somewhere inside this sophistication teenager was the child who had loved hearing stories about jade phoenixes and Chinese princesses. I was about to learn how wrong I was. The moment that shattered my heart happened during the cocktail hour, when the guests were mingling and taking photos before dinner. I was standing near the dessert table, watching Emma pose with her friends, feeling proud of the young woman she had become. The jade brooch caught the light beautifully, and several people had complimented my outfit throughout the evening. Emma was in the center of a group of her closest friends, all of them perfectly dressed and perfectly confident in the way that only teenagers with unlimited resources can be. They were taking selfies, laughing, and discussing their outfits with the casual expertise of people who had never worn anything that wasn't expensive. That's when Emma noticed me approaching. I had simply wanted to be included in one photo with my granddaughter on her special day. It seemed like such a reasonable request, the grandmother who had helped make this celebration possible, asking for one moment to be captured with the birthday girl. Emma, darling, I called softly, approaching the group with my phone ready. Could we take a picture together? The change in Emma's expression was immediate and devastating. She looked at me as if I had committed some terrible social crime, her eyes scanning my outfit with barely concealed horror. Her friends followed her gaze, and I watched their faces shift from polite interest to poorly concealed amusement. My God, Emma said, her voice carrying clearly across the nearby conversations. Grandma, your outfit is so cringe. The word hit me like a physical blow. Cringe. I had heard Emma use this term before, always with disdain, always to describe something she found embarrassing or outdated, but I had never imagined she would use it to describe me. I mean, look at that brooch, she continued, gesturing toward my mother's jade phoenix, as if it were a costume jewelry disaster. It's so old-fashioned, and not in a good way. Her friends erupted in giggles, the kind of mean laughter that teenagers specialize in when they want to establish their superiority over someone they consider beneath them. One of them, a girl named Madison, whom I had met several times before, actually pointed at my brooch. Emma's right, Madison said, her voice dripping with manufactured concern. It's very traditional. The way she said traditional made it sound like a disease. Like, I get that it's probably sentimental or whatever. Another friend chimed in, but maybe save it for family dinners. This is kind of a fashion event. I stood there, frozen, as my granddaughter and her friends dissected my appearance like critics reviewing a particularly disappointing performance. The dress I had chosen so carefully, the brooch that connected me to generations of strong women, the effort I had put into looking my best for her special day, all of it was being dismissed as embarrassing, outdated, cringe. I'm just saying, Emma continued, emboldened by her friend's support. Maybe next time you could, ask me for fashion advice. I could help you pick something more, current. The condescension in her voice was breathtaking. This was my granddaughter, the child I had spoiled and supported and loved unconditionally, speaking to me as if I were a charity case who needed her guidance to dress appropriately. Someone in the group had started recording with their phone, not maliciously, I think, but simply because teenagers document everything. Later, one of the other guests would show me the video, thinking I might want to see my granddaughter's party moments. Instead, I would watch myself being publicly humiliated by the person I loved most in the world. Maybe we should take photos with people who actually fit the aesthetic, Emma suggested, her eyes avoiding mine. Like this is supposed to be elegant and sophisticated. The implication was clear. I was neither elegant nor sophisticated. I was an embarrassment, a fashion mistake, someone who didn't belong at this celebration of wealth and style that my own money had made possible. I felt my face burning with shame and hurt. Around us, other conversations had quieted as people became aware of the drama unfolding. Emma's parents were across the room, talking to other adults, unaware that their daughter was publicly humiliating her grandmother. The hired photographer was discreetly capturing candid moments. And I realized with horror that this scene of my rejection might actually be preserved in the official party photos. Emma, I said quietly, trying to maintain some dignity, I know what you wanted, she interrupted, her voice sharp with impatience. But this isn't really the right time. Maybe later, when there aren't so many people around. Her friends were watching this exchange with the fascinated cruelty of spectators at a gladiator match. They sensed weakness, sensed drama, and they were feeding off it. Emma was performing for them, establishing her sophistication by rejecting her embarrassing ethnic grandmother. I looked at my granddaughter, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. This poised, cruel teenager bore no resemblance to the child who had once loved my stories, who had called me Nai Nai, who had spun in the red kipao like a princess. That child was gone, replaced by someone who valued appearance over substance, trends over tradition, cruelty over kindness. Of course, I said, my voice barely above a whisper. I understand. I backed away from the group, clutching my purse, feeling the weight of the jade brooch like an anchor dragging me down. As I retreated, I heard Emma's voice return to its party brightness, as if nothing had happened. Okay, now let's get some good shots, she said to her friends. The lighting is perfect here. I found a chair in a corner of the ballroom and sat down heavily, my hands shaking. The party continued around me, music, laughter, celebration, but I felt completely alone. The jade brooch that had given my mother strength now felt like a symbol of my failure to bridge the gap between my heritage and my granddaughter's. American life. I stayed for the rest of the party because leaving would have caused more drama, more attention, more embarrassment for Emma, but I spoke to no one else, ate nothing, smiled at nothing. I watched my granddaughter celebrate her 16th birthday surrounded by wealth and privilege that I had provided, while treating me like an unwelcome reminder of a past she wanted to forget. When the party finally ended, I drove home in silence, the video of my humiliation already spreading through Emma's social media accounts like wildfire. By morning, my shame would be entertainment for dozens of teenagers who thought cruelty was just another form of social currency. That night, I cried for the first time since Robert's funeral, grieving not just for my hurt feelings but for the granddaughter I had lost to wealth and privilege, and the kind of casual cruelty that comes from never having to face real consequences for your actions. I didn't sleep that night. I sat in my living room until dawn, still wearing the black dress and the jade brooch, staring at the photo album that had somehow found its way into my hands. The pictures told a different story than the one that had unfolded at the party. They showed a little girl who had loved her grandmother, who had been eager to learn about her heritage, who had seen me as someone special rather than someone embarrassing. There was Emma, at age 5, wearing a traditional Chinese outfit I had bought her for New Year, grinning toothlessly at the camera. There she was at 7, helping me arrange vintage dresses in the shop, so serious and careful with the delicate fabrics. At 9, listening intently as I told her stories about the women who had worn these clothes, her eyes wide with fascination. When had I lost her? When had my granddaughter's love turned to shame? I thought about the early years after Lisa's divorce, when Emma would spend weekends with Robert and me. She had been hungry for attention then, for the stability that her parents' broken marriage couldn't provide. I had filled that need gladly, teaching her to cook dumplings, showing her how to spot quality in vintage pieces, sharing stories about our family history. Tell me about China. Nai Nai, she used to say, curled up next to me on the couch. Tell me about the brave women in our family. I would tell her about my grandmother, who had hidden the family's valuables during the war, about my mother, who had worked in factories to save money for my education, about myself, crossing an ocean with nothing but hope and determination. Emma would listen with the rapt attention that only children can give, absorbing these stories like they were fairy tales about magical princesses. But somewhere along the way, those stories had stopped being magical and started being embarrassing. The brave women became old-fashioned. The struggles became something to hide rather than honor. The heritage became a burden rather than a blessing. I realized now that I had been complicit in this transformation. In my eagerness to give Emma everything I had never had, I had shielded her from understanding what it meant to work for something, to struggle for something, to appreciate something. The trust fund that was meant to give her freedom had instead given her the freedom to reject everything that had made that comfort possible. Robert would have known what to do. He had always been good with Lisa during her teenage years, finding the balance between love and discipline, between support and boundaries. But Robert had been gone for 3 years now, and I had been navigating grandparenthood alone, guided by love but lacking the wisdom to know when love needed to be paired with harder lessons. I thought about calling Lisa, But what would I say? That her daughter had publicly humiliated me, that the trust fund we had both thought was a gift had created a monster. Lisa enjoyed the benefits of Emma's wealth too much to want to examine its consequences too closely. As the sun began to rise, I made myself tea and sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Emma used to do homework while I cooked dinner. I could almost see her there, 10 years old and eager to please, asking for help with math problems and chattering about her day at school. That Emma had loved me unconditionally. She had been proud to tell her classmates about her grandmother, who owned a vintage clothing store. She had brought friends to the shop, showing off my collection like it was the most interesting place in the world. She had worn the clothes I gave her with pride, understanding that they were special because they came with stories, but that Emma had also been dependent on me, financially and emotionally. As she grew older and more independent, as her social world expanded beyond our family, she had started to see our relationship differently. I was no longer the fascinating grandmother with amazing stories. I was the ethnic grandmother who didn't quite fit into her American teenage life. The money had accelerated this process. With her trust fund, Emma didn't need to appreciate the clothes I gave her. She could buy whatever she wanted. She didn't need to listen to my stories about family history. She was busy creating her own narrative of wealth and privilege. She didn't need to work in my shop. She had never needed to work anywhere. I had wanted to give her security, but I had accidentally given her the ability to reject everything I valued without consequences. She could mock my clothes because she had never had to wear secondhand anything. She could dismiss my heritage because she had never needed to rely on family for survival. She could treat me with casual cruelty because she had never faced real hardship herself. The jade brooch lay on the table in front of me, catching the morning light. My mother had worn this brooch through war and poverty and displacement, and it had given her strength. I had worn it through immigration and discrimination and the challenge of building a business in a foreign country, and it had reminded me of who I was. But to Emma, it was just old jewelry, unfashionable and embarrassing, a symbol of everything she wanted to distance herself from. I picked up the brooch and held it to the light, seeing the careful craftsmanship that had gone into carving the jade phoenix. This piece had survived nearly a century, passing from mother to daughter to granddaughter, carrying with it the hopes and dreams and sacrifices of generations of women. It deserved better than to be mocked by a child who had never learned to appreciate anything. That as I sat there in the quiet morning light, surrounded by photographs of a granddaughter who no longer existed, I made a decision. Emma needed to learn where her comfortable life came from. She needed to understand the connection between her designer clothes and my Cringe vintage collection. She needed to face the reality that her wealth was built on the very things she had chosen to mock. I had tried to teach her through love and patience and gentle guidance. Now it was time to try a different approach. It was time for Emma to learn the truth about gratitude, about respect, and about the real cost of the privilege she had taken for granted her entire life. The education was going to begin immediately. Monday morning found me in my home office, surrounded by financial documents that told the story of Emma's privileged life in numbers and bank transfers. The financial records were meticulously organized. I had learned long ago that good business required careful documentation. Now, those same organizational skills would help me show Emma exactly where her money came from. I spread the trust fund statements across my desk like pieces of a puzzle. $3,000 every month for the past 4 years, since Emma turned 12. Before that, smaller amounts had gone into a savings account, building the foundation for her current lifestyle. In total, I had given my granddaughter over $200,000, money that represented years of careful work, successful sales, and the kind of financial discipline that had allowed me to build wealth from nothing. Each transfer had a source, and I began tracing them back to specific sales at my boutique. The January payment had come from selling a 1960s Gucci dress to a collector in New York. February's money had been earned through the sale of a 1940s Dior suit to a costume designer. March came from a particularly good month where I had sold several pieces to a museum building a fashion exhibit. Every single dollar Emma spent so carelessly had been earned through the sale of vintage clothing, the same type of clothing she had called cringe at her party. I opened my laptop and began documenting everything. Screenshots of Emma's social media posts showing her expensive purchases, bank records showing the trust fund transfers, sales receipts from my boutique showing exactly which vintage pieces had funded each of her shopping sprees. The evidence was overwhelming and impossible to deny. the designer handbag she had bought last month, paid for by selling a 1950s Chanel jacket, the expensive dinner she had treated her friends to, funded by a 1920s beaded dress that had taken me months to find and authenticate, the spa day she had enjoyed with Madison, made possible by selling a collection of 1970s Halston pieces to a fashion magazine. Emma's entire lifestyle was built on what she considered outdated, unfashionable, embarrassing clothing. I called my lawyer, Harrison Blake, who had handled the trust fund setup and knew the family situation well. Harrison was in his 70s, a contemporary who understood both my generation's values and the legal complexities of family wealth. "Esther," he said warmly, when his secretary put me through. "How are you? How's Emma?" "That's actually why I'm calling," I said. "I need to understand my options regarding the trust fund." I explained what had happened at the party, the public humiliation, Emma's attitude toward her heritage and toward me. Harrison listened without interruption, occasionally making sympathetic sounds. "I'm not looking to punish her permanently," I clarified. "But she needs to understand where her money comes from. She needs to learn respect and gratitude." "Well," Harrison said thoughtfully, "you do have considerable control over the trust. You're the sole trustee until Emma turns 25, which means you can modify the terms as long as they're in her best interest. Education certainly qualifies as being in her best interest." We discussed various options. I could temporarily suspend payments. I could require her to meet certain conditions to receive the money. I could add work requirements or educational components. The trust document I had created was flexible, designed to allow me to respond to changing circumstances in Emma's life. "What exactly are you thinking?" Harrison asked. "I want her to work," I said. "I want her to understand how money is earned. I want her to see the value in the things she's been mocking." "That sounds very reasonable," Harrison said. "Let me draft some modifications to the trust terms. We can make her payments contingent on working at your boutique, learning about the business, contributing to the family legacy instead of just consuming from it." After hanging up with Harrison, I continued my research into Emma's spending patterns. Her credit card statements made for depressing reading. Hundreds of dollars spent on clothes she wore once. Expensive meals at restaurants, where the cost of a single dinner could have fed a family for a week. Impulse purchases of jewelry, shoes, accessories, all the meaningless luxuries that people buy when money has no connection to effort. I calculated that Emma's monthly shopping budget exceeded what I had lived on during my first year in America. The irony was staggering. My granddaughter was spending more on entertainment than I had once spent on survival, and she was doing it with money earned by selling the very things she found embarrassing. The most painful discovery came when I looked through her social media posts from the past year. Photo after photo of expensive purchases, each one tagged with enthusiastic captions about her latest finds. Designer shoes, obsessed with these, a luxury handbag, best birthday gift ever, expensive skincare products, self-care Sunday. But there was not a single mention of her grandmother, her family, or any awareness of where the money for these luxuries came from. I had been erased from her narrative of wealth and privilege, reduced to an embarrassing relative who wore cringe jewelry and didn't understand fashion. Emma had created a fiction where she was simply a wealthy teenager whose money appeared, magically, with no connection to the hard work and sacrifice that had actually made her lifestyle possible. She had written me out of her own story, keeping the benefits of my success while rejecting everything about me personally. I spent the afternoon organizing all of this evidence into a clear, undeniable presentation. Photos of Emma's purchases next to photos of the vintage pieces that had paid for them. Bank statements showing the direct correlation between my sales and her spending. Social media posts demonstrating her casual attitude toward money that others had worked hard to earn. By evening, I had everything I needed to show Emma the truth about her privileged life. The education would begin with facts, with numbers, with the kind of clear evidence that even a spoiled teenager couldn't argue with. But first, I needed to visit my boutique to remind myself why this work mattered, why these clothes deserved respect, and why teaching Emma these lessons was worth the temporary damage it might do to our relationship. Some truths are too important to avoid, even when they hurt. Tuesday morning brought me to my boutique earlier than usual, seeking comfort in the familiar space that had been my refuge for over 30 years. The vintage Chanel jacket hanging in the window caught the morning light. Beautivia, 1960s piece, in navy wool, with the iconic chain-weighted hem. I had sold one just like it last month for $3,000, money that had gone directly into Emma's trust fund and been spent within days on a shopping spree she had documented enthusiastically on Instagram. The irony wasn't lost on me as I unlocked the door and stepped into my sanctuary. My boutique had always been more than a business, it was a museum of fashion history, a place where beautiful things found new life with people who appreciated them. Every piece had been carefully selected, researched, and restored. I knew the provenance of each item, the story behind every designer, the craftsmanship that made these clothes more than just fabric and thread. I walked through the racks slowly, touching pieces that Emma had never bothered to understand. A 1940s evening gown that had survived the war, a 1970s Halston dress that embodied the glamour of Studio 54, a 1920s beaded flapper dress that had danced through the Jazz Age. Each piece was Cringe to my granddaughter, but to me, they represented artistry, history, and the kind of timeless beauty that transcended trends. Jennifer, my longtime employee, arrived at 9 with her usual enthusiasm for the work. She was in her 30s now, no longer the fashion student who had started working for me 15 years ago. She had learned the business well, developing her own expertise in authenticating pieces and understanding what made certain items valuable. "You're here early," she said, noticing my contemplative mood. "Everything okay?" I told her about the party, about Emma's public humiliation, about the decision I had made to teach my granddaughter some difficult lessons. Jennifer listened with the kind of understanding that comes from years of working together. "I'm not surprised," she said sadly. "Emma hasn't been in the shop for years. She used to love coming here when she was little. Remember, she'd play dress-up with the vintage pieces and ask a million questions about everything." I did remember. Emma, at 8 years old, carefully handling a 1950s party dress, asking about the woman who had worn it to dances. Emma, at 10, helping me photograph pieces for the website, taking her job as my assistant very seriously. Emma, at 12, still interested enough to occasionally visit after school, but somewhere around 14, the visits had stopped, the questions had ended. The little girl who had seen magic in vintage clothing had been replaced by a teenager who saw only outdated embarrassments. "What are you planning to do?" Jennifer asked. I showed her the financial documentation I had prepared, the clear connection between Emma's lifestyle and the boutique's sales. Jennifer whistled softly as she looked through the papers. "She really doesn't know, does she? She has no idea that her shopping money comes from selling vintage clothes." "None at all," I confirmed. "In her mind, the money just appears. She's never connected her trust fund to my work." A customer came in then, a woman in her 50s looking for something special for her daughter's wedding. I watched Jennifer help her, explaining the history of different pieces, showing her how to spot quality construction, sharing the stories that made each dress more than just clothing. The customer fell in love with a 1960s Oleg Cassini gown, the kind of piece that Jackie Kennedy might have worn. As she tried it on, her whole demeanor changed. She stood taller, smiled brighter, moved with more grace. This was the magic of vintage clothing. It didn't just cover your body, it connected you to the women who had worn these pieces before, to the glamour and elegance of eras gone by. "It's perfect," the customer said, tears in her eyes. "I feel like a queen." "You look like one too," I told her, and meant it, as she completed her purchase. $1,500 for a dress that would make her daughter's wedding even more special. I thought about Emma's casual dismissal of this work. To my granddaughter, vintage clothing was outdated and embarrassing, but to this customer, and to hundreds of others over the years, these pieces were treasures that made important moments more meaningful. The afternoon brought more customers, each with their own story. A young designer, looking for inspiration. A collector searching for a specific Pucci print. A costume designer needing authentic 1970s pieces for a period film. Each person who walked through my door understood something that Emma had forgotten: that fashion history mattered, that craftsmanship had value, that some things became more beautiful with age rather than less. I spent my lunch break calculating numbers. The vintage Chanel jacket in the window would pay for Emma's next shopping spree. The Halston dress I had sold last week had funded her recent spa day with friends. The collection of 1940s pieces I was preparing for a museum exhibition would cover her expenses for the next 2 months. Every beautiful, historic, carefully curated item in my shop was Cringe to the person whose lifestyle it funded. That afternoon, I called Emma. "Hi, Grandma," she said, her voice carrying the false brightness that had replaced our old, easy affection. "What's up?" "I'd like you to come to the boutique tomorrow," I said calmly. "There are some things we need to discuss." "Oh," she said, and I could hear the discomfort in her voice. "I'm kind of busy this week. Maybe next weekend." "Tomorrow, Emma, it's important." There was a pause. "Is this about the party?" "Look, if you're upset about the photos or whatever, tomorrow at 4 o'clock, I interrupted gently but firmly. "We have some family business to discuss." After I hung up, I stood in my beautiful boutique, surrounded by clothes that represented decades of hard work and expertise, and prepared for the most difficult conversation of my relationship with my granddaughter. Emma was about to learn that her comfortable life had been built on everything she claimed to find embarrassing. The education would begin with truth, continue with consequences, and hopefully end with understanding. But first, she had to face the reality of where her money actually came from. The customer testimonial letters had been accumulating for years, filed carefully in a folder I kept in my office. As I read through them that evening, preparing for Emma's visit, I was reminded of the impact my work had on people's lives. These weren't just business transactions, they were connections to history, to beauty, to moments that mattered. "Dear Esther," one letter began, "the 1950s wedding dress you found for my daughter's vintage-themed ceremony was absolutely perfect. She felt like a princess, and the photos are stunning. Thank you for helping make her day so special." Another, "I've been collecting vintage Pucci for 20 years, and your eye for authentic pieces is unmatched. The dress I bought from you last month is now the centerpiece of my collection, and my favorite. As a costume designer, I depend on people like you to maintain the integrity of period films. Your boutique is a treasure trove of authentic pieces that help bring stories to life." These letters represented something Emma had never understood: that my work had value beyond the money it generated. I wasn't just selling old clothes. I was preserving fashion history, helping people connect with the past, making special moments more meaningful. I decided to share some of these perspectives with people whose opinions Emma might actually value. The first call I made was to Sarah Chen, a fashion blogger with a significant social media following. Sarah was in her 20s, part of Emma's generation, but she understood the value of vintage fashion in ways my granddaughter didn't. "Esther," Sarah said warmly when she answered, "I was just thinking about you. I'm working on a piece about sustainable fashion, and vintage collecting is such an important part of that conversation." I explained the situation carefully, not wanting to embarrass Emma publicly but needing Sarah to understand why this education was necessary. "Oh wow," Sarah said. "She really doesn't get it, does she? Vintage is so hot right now. All the influencers I know are obsessed with finding authentic pieces. Your boutique is like the holy grail for people who understand fashion. Would you be willing to talk to her?" I asked. "Help her understand that vintage clothing isn't outdated, it's actually very current." "Absolutely," Sarah agreed. "I'd love to visit your shop anyway. I'll bring my photographer and do a feature on your collection." Maybe seeing vintage fashion through a contemporary lens will help her understand. My next call was to Maria Rodriguez, a fashion professor at the local design school. Maria often brought her students to my boutique for educational visits, teaching them about fashion history through hands-on examination of vintage pieces. "Your granddaughter sounds like she needs a reality check," Maria said bluntly, after I explained the situation. "These young people think fashion started with fast fashion brands. They have no appreciation for craftsmanship, for the artistry that went into creating clothes that have lasted decades." "Could you explain that to her?" I asked, "from an academic perspective?" "I'd be happy to," Maria said. "In fact, I'm putting together a lecture series on fashion sustainability, the environmental impact of fast fashion versus the value of vintage pieces. Maybe she needs to understand that her attitude isn't just disrespectful, it's actually harmful to the planet." I also reached out to some of my longtime customers, people who had become friends over the years. Eleanor Whitman, a retired actress who had been buying from me for 15 years, was particularly upset when I told her about Emma's behavior. "That child has no idea how lucky she is," Eleanor said indignantly. "Do you know how many people would give anything to have a grandmother with your expertise? I've learned more about fashion history from you than from all the stylists I worked with in Hollywood." "She sees vintage clothing as embarrassing," I explained. "Embarrassing?" Eleanor laughed. "Honey, I wore a dress from your shop to the Academy Awards 3 years ago. The fashion critics called it timelessly elegant. If Emma thinks vintage is embarrassing, she doesn't understand fashion at all. By the end of the evening, I had assembled a small group of allies, people who understood the value of my work and could help Emma see it from a different perspective. These weren't dusty historians or out-of-touch older people. They were contemporary voices, people from Emma's generation or adjacent to it, who had learned to appreciate the beauty and craftsmanship of vintage fashion. I also prepared a portfolio of recent media coverage of my boutique, a feature in Vogue about the resurgence of vintage fashion, with a quote from me about the importance of preserving fashion history, an article in the Los Angeles Times about sustainable fashion, highlighting vintage shopping as an environmentally conscious choice, a blog post from a prominent fashion influencer, calling my boutique a hidden gem for people who understand real style. This wasn't the opinion of one out-of-touch grandmother. This was validation from the fashion industry itself that vintage clothing was valuable, current, and worthy of respect. The final piece of my preparation was reaching out to other business owners in my area, people who had built successful enterprises through hard work and expertise. I wanted Emma to understand that entrepreneurship, especially as an immigrant woman, required courage, intelligence, and persistence. James Kim, who owned a successful restaurant chain, agreed to speak with Emma about what it meant to build something from nothing. Young people today don't understand sacrifice, he said. They think success just happens. Maybe hearing from someone closer to her parents' age will help. Linda Thompson, who had built a boutique hotel empire, offered similar support. I started with one small property and grew it through reinvesting every penny, she said. If this girl thinks business success is easy, she needs to learn better. By Wednesday evening, I had assembled a compelling case for the value and relevance of my work. These weren't just my opinions or the perspectives of my generation. These were contemporary voices from fashion, academia, business, and media, all confirming that vintage clothing was far from cringe. It was actually at the forefront of current fashion thinking. Ma would arrive at my boutique tomorrow, expecting a typical grandmother's lecture about respect and gratitude. Instead, she would encounter a comprehensive education about the fashion industry, the value of craftsmanship, the importance of sustainability, and the expertise required to succeed in a competitive business. She would learn that her cringe grandmother was actually a respected expert in a field that she had never bothered to understand. The testimonial letters went back into their folder, but their messages stayed with me. People appreciated my work. People valued my expertise. People understood that what I did mattered. It was time for my granddaughter to learn the same lesson. The trust fund termination documents sat on my desk like a loaded weapon, legal papers that Harrison had prepared but that I prayed I wouldn't need to use. The modified trust agreement was less drastic but equally serious. Emma's monthly payments would be suspended until she met certain educational and work requirements. She would have to earn her allowance by learning about the business that had made her lifestyle possible. I arranged my office carefully for our 4 o'clock meeting. The financial documents were organized in clear, logical order. Bank statements showing the trust fund transfers, sales receipts from the boutique showing the source of that money, screenshots of Emma's social media posts showing how carelessly she spent what others worked hard to earn. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. But I also included the positive materials, the customer testimonials, the media coverage, the academic perspectives on vintage fashion. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about education. Emma needed to understand not just that her behavior was wrong, but why her attitudes were based on ignorance rather than knowledge. Jennifer had agreed to stay late to help with the confrontation, providing witness to whatever transpired and offering support from someone closer to Emma's generation. Sarah Chen, the fashion blogger, would arrive at 4:30 with her photographer, ostensibly for a feature story but really to show Emma how contemporary voices viewed vintage fashion. At 3:30, I called Lisa to give her a heads up about what was coming. "You're doing what?" Lisa said, her voice rising with alarm. "I'm teaching your daughter about respect and gratitude," I said calmly. "She needs to understand where her money comes from and why her behavior at the party was unacceptable." "Mom, she's just a teenager. They say stupid things sometimes. You can't cut off her trust fund over one comment." "This isn't about one comment, Lisa. This is about years of entitled behavior that we've all enabled. Emma treats me with disrespect because she's never faced consequences for it, but her allowance sheet depends on that money. She depends on money she's never earned for luxuries she doesn't need, I corrected. Maybe it's time she learned the difference between wants and needs. Lisa was quiet for a moment. What do you want her to do? Work, learn, understand that money comes from effort, not entitlement. Appreciate the business that has supported her comfortable life instead of mocking it. For how long? Until she demonstrates that she's learned these lessons. Until she can treat me and my work with the respect they deserve. After hanging up with Lisa, I spent the remaining time reviewing my plan. This conversation would be the most important one Emma and I had ever had. It would either begin her education in gratitude and respect, or it would permanently damage our relationship. But I had decided that a relationship based on her contempt for me wasn't worth preserving anyway. At 4 o'clock exactly, Emma arrived. She looked beautiful, as always, her hair perfectly styled, her outfit expensive and trendy, her makeup flawless. She was every inch the privileged teenager who had never wanted for anything, who had never connected comfort with effort. "Hi, Grandma," she said, settling into the chair across from my desk with the casual confidence of someone who had never faced serious consequences. "So what's this family business you wanted to talk about?" I studied her for a moment, this young woman who carried my DNA but none of my values, who had benefited from my success while rejecting everything I represented. "It's about your trust fund," I said simply. Something flickered in her eyes, not concern. Exactly, but attention. Money always got Emma's attention. "What about it?" I slid the first document across the desk, her bank statement showing the monthly $3,000 transfers. "Do you know where this money comes from?" Emma glanced at the statement with the bored expression of someone reviewing information they already knew. "My trust fund. You set it up for me." "Yes, but where does the money in the trust fund come from?" She shrugged. "Your business, I guess. The vintage store." "These vintage clothes," I said, gesturing toward the racks visible through my office window. "The same clothes you called cringe at your party." For the first time, Emma looked uncomfortable. "Look, if you're upset about that, I'm not upset, Emma. I'm disappointed, and I'm concerned that you don't understand the connection between your lifestyle and my work." I slid the next set of documents across the desk. Sales receipts matched with her credit card statements. "This designer handbag you bought last month. It was paid for by selling a 1960s Chanel jacket. This expensive dinner you treated your friends to. Funded by a 1940s Dior suit. This spa day you enjoyed. Made possible by selling a collection of vintage Halston pieces." Emma's eyes widened as she looked through the papers, seeing for the first time the direct correlation between her spending and my sales. "Every dollar you spend so carelessly," I continued, "comes from selling the clothes you find embarrassing. Your entire lifestyle is built on vintage fashion." The color was draining from Emma's face as the reality sank in. I didn't know. You didn't know because you never asked. You never showed any interest in how the money was earned. You just took it and spent it and mocked the source." I slid the final document across the desk, the modified trust agreement. "Your monthly allowance is suspended, effective immediately." "What?" Emma's voice cracked with panic. "You can't do that." "I can, and I have. The trust terms have been modified. If you want to continue receiving money, you'll have to earn it." "How?" "By working here, in my boutique, by learning about the business, by understanding why these clothes deserve respect instead of mockery, by treating me with the courtesy I should have received all along." Emma stared at the documents as if they might change if she looked hard enough. "For how long?" "Until you demonstrate that you've learned what I'm trying to teach you. Until you can appreciate the work that has supported your comfortable life. Until you can treat your heritage with pride instead of shame." The door chimed as Sarah Chen arrived with her photographer, right on schedule. "Esther," Sarah called out, "ready for our interview about vintage fashion's influence on contemporary style." Emma looked from me to Sarah to the photographer, beginning to understand that this was more than just a private family conversation. This was her education beginning, whether she was ready for it or not. "Emma," I said gently, "meet Sarah Chen. She's a fashion blogger who understands what you don't. That vintage clothing isn't cringe. It's the foundation of everything that's stylish and sustainable in fashion today." The look on Emma's face was a mixture of confusion, panic, and the first glimmerings of understanding. Her comfortable world was about to become much more complicated. The collection of receipts spread across my desk told the story of Emma's entire lifestyle in devastating detail. Hundreds of small pieces of paper, each representing a vintage piece, sold and converted into my granddaughter's spending money. As Sarah began photographing the boutique for her article, Emma sat frozen in her chair, staring at the evidence of her financial dependence on everything she had mocked. "I don't understand," Emma said quietly, her usual confidence completely shaken. "You're saying all my money comes from old clothes." "Not old clothes," I corrected. "Vintage fashion, designer pieces, historical garments that collectors pay thousands of dollars to own. The same clothes you called cringe at your party." I picked up a receipt from the top of the pile. "This 1950s Christian Dior suit that I sold last month for $2,500, that paid for your recent shopping trip to Beverly Hills. Every designer handbag, every expensive dinner, every luxury you've enjoyed, it all comes from selling vintage clothing." Emma's hands trembled as she reached for the receipts, examining them with the dawning horror of someone discovering an uncomfortable truth. "But I mean, Mom said the trust fund was just your savings." "My savings from 30 years of building this business, my expertise in identifying valuable pieces that other people overlook, my reputation in the fashion industry that allows me to charge premium prices for authenticated vintage pieces." Sarah approached my desk, having finished her initial photography. "Excuse me," she said to Emma with genuine curiosity. "Are you related to Esther? You're so lucky. Your grandmother is legendary in the vintage fashion world. I've been following her work for years." Emma looked at Sarah with confusion. "Following her work?" "Oh yes," Sarah continued enthusiastically. "Esther Wong is one of the most respected vintage clothing experts in Los Angeles. Fashion magazines quote her all the time. Collectors from around the world buy from her boutique. She's authenticated pieces for major museums." I watched Emma's face as this information sank in. To her, I was just her embarrassing grandmother who wore outdated jewelry and spoke with an accent. She had never bothered to learn about my professional reputation, my expertise, my standing in the fashion community. "I had no idea," Emma whispered. "That's the problem," I said gently but firmly. "You've spent years taking money from this business without ever bothering to understand what the business actually is." I pulled out my laptop and showed Emma my boutique's website, the social media accounts with thousands of followers, the features in fashion magazines. "This isn't some dusty old shop selling used clothes. This is a curated collection of fashion history, authenticated and preserved for people who understand quality and craftsmanship." Sarah leaned over to look at the screen. "Oh, this feature, in Vogue, I remember this. They called your boutique a treasure trove for fashion insiders. And this piece in Harper's Bazaar about sustainable fashion, they interviewed you as an expert." Emma stared at the articles, seeing her grandmother's work through outside eyes for the first time. "You're in Vogue." "Multiple times," I confirmed. "The fashion industry respects this work, Emma. The only person who finds it embarrassing is you." I opened another folder and pulled out the customer testimonials. "Read these," I said, handing them to Emma. "These are letters from people who appreciate what I do." Emma read silently, her expression changing with each letter. "A museum curator, thanking me for donating authentic pieces for an exhibition. A celebrity stylist praising my expertise in finding the perfect vintage piece for a red carpet event. A young designer crediting me with inspiring her entire collection." "I never knew," Emma said, her voice barely audible. "Because you never asked. Because you decided that anything connected to your Chinese heritage, to your grandmother's generation, to vintage anything, was automatically embarrassing." Sarah was photographing some of the boutique's most beautiful pieces, each click of her camera capturing the artistry and craftsmanship that Emma had dismissed. "This 1960s Pucci dress is incredible," Sarah called out. "The print, the construction, this is museum quality." "That piece is worth $4,000, I told Emma. "It will probably pay for your next 2 months of expenses, if you're allowed to continue receiving money from the trust fund." Emma's eyes snapped back to mine. "About that, you can't really cut me off completely, can you? I have expenses. I have commitments." "What commitments?" I asked. "Your spa appointments, your shopping trips, your expensive dinners with friends who like you because you always pick up the check." "It's not like that, isn't it?" I interrupted. "When was the last time you did something that didn't cost money? When was the last time you created something instead of just consuming? When was the last time you earned anything through your own effort?" Emma was quiet, unable to answer because we both knew the truth. Her entire identity was built around spending money she had never earned on things that required no effort, no skill, no contribution to the world. The modified trust agreement is very simple, I continued, handing her the legal document. You can continue receiving your allowance, but only if you work here, in the boutique. You'll learn about vintage fashion, about business, about the difference between value and price. You'll understand how money is earned instead of just how it's spent, for how long, until you can demonstrate that you've learned what I'm trying to teach you, until you can look at a vintage piece and see its history, its craftsmanship, its value, until you can treat this work and me with respect instead of embarrassment. Emma looked around the boutique with new eyes, seeing it not as her grandmother's embarrassing hobby, but as a serious business that had funded her entire lifestyle. The beautiful pieces, the carefully organized displays, the obvious expertise required to maintain such a collection, it was all completely different from what she had imagined. What would I have to do? She asked quietly. Learn, work, contribute, understand that every dollar you've spent came from this business that you've been mocking. Sarah finished her photography and approached us again. I hope you don't mind me saying this, she said to Emma, but you should be incredibly proud of your grandmother. The vintage fashion community has so much respect for her expertise. She's preserved fashion history and made it accessible to people who appreciate quality. Emma nodded numbly, still processing the revelation that her cringe grandmother was actually a respected expert in a field she had never bothered to understand. The choice is yours, I said to Emma. You can continue living on money earned by selling vintage clothing, but only if you're willing to learn about and contribute to the business that makes it possible. Or you can reject the money along with the work, but you can't have one without the other anymore. Emma stared at the receipts, the testimonials, the evidence of a successful business built through decades of expertise and hard work. For the first time in her life, she was facing the reality that money came from somewhere, that her comfortable lifestyle had been built on the foundation of work she had never appreciated. The education was just beginning. The business awards lined the wall behind my desk like silent witnesses to decades of hard work and professional recognition. As Emma sat in stunned silence, processing the reality of her financial dependence on vintage fashion, I stood and began taking down the framed certificates and photographs that told the story of my career. Small Business Owner of the Year, 1995, I said, placing the first award on my desk in front of Emma. Fashion Industry Excellence Award, 2001, Historic Preservation Society Recognition, 2008, Women in Business Leadership Award, 2015. Each award landed with a soft thud, building a wall of achievement that Emma had never bothered to notice. These weren't participation trophies or honorary gestures, they were recognition from professional organizations, industry peers, and community leaders who understood the value of my work. I had no idea, Emma whispered, touching the edge of a photograph showing me receiving an award from the mayor for contributing to the city's cultural heritage. Of course you didn't, I said, not unkindly. You've spent so much energy being embarrassed by me that you never learned who I actually am. Sarah had finished her photography and was now taking notes for her article. Could you tell me about your authentication process? She asked. How do you verify that a piece is genuine versus a reproduction? I welcomed the chance to demonstrate my expertise for Emma's benefit. It starts with understanding the construction techniques of different eras, I explained, pulling a 1940s dress from a nearby rack. See these hand-finished seams, the way the zipper is installed, the specific type of label and how it's attached. These details tell you not just whether a piece is authentic, but when it was made and often by whom. Emma watched with growing amazement as I pointed out details she had never noticed, the difference between machine and hand stitching, the evolution of zipper placement, the way different designers signed their work through subtle construction choices. This level of expertise takes decades to develop, Sarah noted. You can't just learn this from watching YouTube videos. Exactly, I agreed. When Emma was younger, she used to help me research pieces. She was actually quite good at spotting quality, but she lost interest when she decided that anything vintage was automatically uncool. I pulled out a portfolio of my authentication work from major auction houses and museums. Sotheby's consults with me on vintage fashion auctions. The Metropolitan Museum has asked me to authenticate pieces for their costume collection. The Los Angeles County Museum of Art hired me to curate their Century of Style exhibition. Emma flipped through the portfolio with the expression of someone discovering that their supposedly ordinary grandmother was actually a secret celebrity. Photos of me with museum curators, articles quoting my expertise, invitations to fashion industry events that Emma had never known I attended. "You go to fashion weeks?" Emma asked, staring at a photo of me backstage at a vintage fashion show. "I'm often invited to speak about fashion history and sustainability," I confirmed. "The industry values institutional knowledge, especially from people who have preserved and understood fashion evolution over decades." Jennifer joined our conversation, carrying a stack of recent correspondence. "Esther, that collector from Tokyo, is still interested in the 1920s Fortuny gown. And the costume designer from that new period film wants to schedule another appointment to look at your 1960s pieces." Emma looked from Jennifer to me to Sarah, beginning to understand that she was surrounded by people who took my work seriously, who valued my expertise, who saw me as someone important rather than someone embarrassing. "I feel so stupid," Emma said quietly. "You're not stupid," I corrected. "You're uninformed. There's a difference, and uninformed can be fixed." I sat back down across from her, my voice becoming gentler. "Emma, I understand that you want to fit in with your friends, that you want to be seen as modern and current, but vintage fashion isn't the opposite of contemporary style, it's the foundation of it. Everything your favorite designers do today is based on techniques and aesthetics that were developed decades ago." Sarah nodded enthusiastically. "That's exactly what my article is about, the way vintage pieces influence current trends. Instagram influencers are obsessed with finding authentic vintage pieces because they want to wear something unique, something with history. Your friends spend thousands of dollars trying to buy individuality," I told Emma, "but authentic vintage pieces give you that automatically. No one else will be wearing the same dress because it's literally one of a kind." Emma was quiet for a long moment, absorbing this new perspective. "So when I called your clothes cringe, you were dismissing an entire industry that respects my expertise. You were mocking the source of your own financial security. You were rejecting your heritage and your family's achievements because you'd never bothered to understand what they actually were." The weight of her ignorance was clearly settling on Emma's shoulders. "I really messed up, didn't I?" "You made mistakes based on assumptions," I said. "But mistakes can be corrected if you're willing to learn." I pulled out the modified trust fund agreement again. "This isn't punishment, Emma. It's education. You'll work here 20 hours a week, learning about fashion history, business operations, customer service, and authentication. You'll understand how money is earned, how expertise is developed, how respect is built. And if I do this, I can keep getting my allowance. You'll earn your allowance. There's a difference." Emma looked around the boutique with new eyes, seeing it not as her grandmother's embarrassing hobby but as a serious business that required real expertise. "What would I have to do exactly?" "Start at the beginning. Learn about different fashion eras, about designers and their signatures, about what makes certain pieces valuable, help with inventory, customer service, social media. Understand that this business isn't just about selling clothes, it's about preserving fashion history. How long would it take? That depends on how quickly you learn and how seriously you take the work. Some people develop an eye for vintage fashion quickly, others take years, but you won't continue receiving money until you can demonstrate that you understand and respect what this business actually is." Emma picked up one of the customer testimonial letters and read it again. "This woman says you helped her feel beautiful on her daughter's wedding day. That's what good vintage fashion does," I explained. "It connects people to elegance, to history, to a time when clothes were made to last and designed to make the wearer feel special. It's not just about covering your body, it's about connecting to something larger than yourself." Sarah finished her notes and prepared to leave. "Emma," she said, "I hope you take this opportunity seriously. Your grandmother is offering you access to expertise that people pay thousands of dollars to learn from. Fashion students would kill for this kind of mentorship." After Sarah left, Emma and I sat in the quiet boutique, surrounded by decades of carefully curated fashion history. The awards were still spread across my desk, tangible proof of recognition that Emma had never known existed. "I need to think about this," Emma said finally. "Of course," I agreed. "But understand that your current allowance stops immediately. If you want to continue receiving money, you'll need to start working here. The choice is entirely yours." Emma stood up slowly, looking around the boutique one more time. Can I take some of these articles home? The ones about you in the fashion magazines? I nodded, gathering the materials into a folder for her. There's more where that came from. I've been featured in dozens of publications over the years. As Emma prepared to leave, she turned back to me with an expression I hadn't seen since she was a child, genuine curiosity mixed with something that might have been respect. Grandma, she said hesitantly, I'm sorry about what I said at the party. I really didn't know. I know you didn't, I said. But now you do. The question is what you're going to do with that knowledge. Emma left with her folder of articles, and her world completely turned upside down. For the first time in years, she had been forced to see me not as an embarrassing relic from another era, but as an accomplished professional who had built something meaningful and lasting. The education was just beginning, but already I could see cracks in the wall of assumptions she had built around vintage fashion. Around me, around the source of her comfortable life. Whether those cracks would become openings for understanding remained to be seen. But, for the first time since that devastating night at her party, I felt hope. The modified trust fund agreement arrived at Emma's house 3 days later, delivered by certified mail to ensure there was no confusion about its seriousness. The document was clear and uncompromising. No work, no money. 20 hours per week at the boutique, demonstrating understanding of fashion, history, and business operations, treating the work and the workspace with respect. Emma called me that evening, her voice smaller than I had heard it in years. I read the agreement, she said. When do I start? Monday morning at 9, I replied. Dress appropriately for work, not for a fashion show. And Emma, leave your attitude at home. The first day was a disaster. Emma arrived 15 minutes late, wearing designer jeans that cost more than most people's weekly salary and carrying a handbag that could have fed a family for a month. She looked around the boutique like she was visiting a museum of curiosities rather than preparing to work. So what do I do? She asked, checking her phone for messages. Put the phone away, I said firmly. When you're working, you're working. Customer service requires attention. The morning was spent on basics: how to greet customers, how to handle vintage pieces carefully, how to recognize the difference between different eras of fashion. Emma's attention wandered constantly. She was accustomed to immediate gratification, to having information delivered in bite-sized social media posts, not to the sustained focus that learning actually required. This is really boring, she complained after an hour of learning about fabric care. Running a business isn't entertainment, I replied. It's work, that's why they call it work. By the end of her first week, Emma was exhausted and frustrated. She had always been able to buy her way out of discomfort, but now she was facing something money couldn't solve: the need to develop actual skills and knowledge. I don't think I'm good at this, she said on Friday afternoon, slumping in the office chair. Of course, you're not good at it, I said. You've been here 5 days. I've been doing this for 30 years. The question is whether you're willing to get good at it. The weekend gave Emma time to reflect, and she came back on Monday with a slightly different attitude. She had spent the weekend without her usual allowance, unable to make the impulse purchases that had become second nature. For the first time in years, she had to think before spending, had to consider whether she actually needed something before buying it. It's weird not having money, she admitted. I never realized how much I spend on stuff I don't even really want. That's the beginning of wisdom, I told her. The second week was better. Emma began to pay attention to the customers, to notice how they reacted to different pieces, to understand that each item had its own appeal for different people. She watched me authenticate a 1960s Pucci dress, asking questions about the details that proved its authenticity. How do you remember all of this? She asked. Years of practice, years of studying, years of making mistakes and learning from them. By the third week, something had shifted. Emma was arriving on time, asking genuine questions, showing real interest in the work. She helped a customer find a vintage dress for a themed party, and when the woman left happy with her purchase, Emma actually smiled. She really loved that dress. Emma said, because you helped her find something special. That's what this business is about, connecting people with pieces that make them feel beautiful and unique. The real breakthrough came when Emma found her first valuable piece at an estate sale I had taken her to. Among tables of ordinary clothing, she spotted a 1950s cocktail dress that had been mislabeled and underpriced. This looks like it might be something, she said hesitantly, Bringing the dress to me, I examined it carefully, checking the label, the construction, the fabric. It was a Norman Norell design, worth at least $1,500, priced at $25 by sellers who didn't know what they had. How did you spot this? I asked. The beadwork, Emma said, gaining confidence. It's hand-sewn, not machine-applied. And the label is positioned exactly where you taught me authentic Norell labels should be. I felt a surge of pride and hope. Emma was learning. She was developing an eye for quality, understanding what made certain pieces valuable. More importantly, she was finding satisfaction in the discovery, in the knowledge, in the skill itself. Well done, I said simply. But I could see that my approval meant something to her. That evening, Emma helped me research the dress, learning about Norman Norell's career, his contribution to American fashion, his place in fashion history. For the first time since she was a child, we worked together on something that required thought and knowledge, rather than just money. This is actually pretty interesting, Emma admitted as we read about Norell's influence on 1950s fashion. Fashion history is fascinating when you understand the context, I agreed. Every piece tells a story about the time it was made, the woman who wore it, the designer who created it. The dress sold 2 weeks later for $1,800 to a collector who appreciated its rarity and condition. Emma watched the transaction with new understanding. This wasn't just selling old clothes, it was connecting historical pieces with people who valued them appropriately. I helped find that, she said with quiet pride. You did. And that sale will contribute to your next allowance payment. For the first time, Emma understood the connection between effort and reward, between skill and compensation, between work and money. The trust fund payment that month came with a breakdown showing exactly how it had been earned, her hours worked, her contributions to sales, her growing understanding of the business. I actually earned this, she said, looking at the payment notification. You did. How does it feel? Emma was quiet for a moment. Different, she said finally. Better, I think. Like it actually means something. The transformation wasn't complete, still had moments of impatience, still struggled with the sustained attention that expertise required, but she was learning, growing, developing skills and knowledge that no amount of money could have purchased for her. More importantly, she was beginning to see me not as an embarrassing grandmother but as a teacher, a mentor, someone whose knowledge and experience had value. The boutique wasn't a burden to endure but a place where she could learn something meaningful. The modified trust fund agreement had accomplished exactly what I had hoped it, had forced Emma to earn her allowance by learning to appreciate the work that made it possible. She was still my granddaughter, but she was becoming a granddaughter I could be proud of again. The new photograph sits on my desk now, next to the old one from my grand opening 30 years ago. In this recent picture, Emma and I stand together, in the boutique, both smiling genuinely for the first time in years. She's wearing a vintage 1970s blouse that she chose herself not because it was expensive or trendy, but because she understood its craftsmanship and appreciated its history. 3 months had passed since our confrontation. 3 months of Emma working at the boutique, learning about fashion history, developing skills she had never known she possessed. The transformation had been gradual but profound, like watching a flower bloom in slow motion. The turning point came on a busy Saturday when I was helping multiple customers and Emma took initiative to assist a young woman looking for a wedding dress. I watched from across the shop as my granddaughter carefully showed the customer different options, explaining the history of each piece, helping her understand what made vintage wedding dresses special. This 1950s dress has the most beautiful hand-beating, Emma explained, her voice carrying the kind of knowledge that only comes from genuine understanding. The construction is incredible. See how the bodice is structured to create this elegant silhouette. And the silk has aged beautifully, developing this ivory patina that you can't get with modern fabrics. The customer was enchanted, trying on the dress and falling in love with both its beauty and its history. When she decided to purchase it, Emma handled the entire transaction professionally, carefully wrapping the dress and explaining the care instructions. Thank you so much, the customer said to Emma. You really understand these pieces. I feel like I'm not just buying a dress, I'm becoming part of its story. After the customer left, Emma turned to me with an expression of pure satisfaction. She loved it, Emma said. She really understood why that dress was special. Because you helped her understand, I replied. You shared your knowledge in a way that made her appreciate what she was buying. That was the moment I knew Emma had truly changed. She wasn't just going through the motions of working at the boutique, she was finding meaning in the work itself, taking pride in her growing expertise, understanding that knowledge and skill were valuable in ways that had nothing to do with money. The relationship between us had changed too. Emma had stopped seeing me as an embarrassing relic and started seeing me as someone with valuable knowledge to share. She asked genuine questions about fashion, history, about business, about my experiences building the boutique from nothing. "Tell me about when you first came to America," she said one slow afternoon, settling into the chair across from my desk. I told her stories I hadn't shared in years, about the discrimination I had faced, the language barriers, the financial struggles, the determination that had driven me to succeed despite every obstacle. Emma listened with the kind of attention she had once reserved for social media, asking thoughtful questions and making connections I hadn't expected. "You were so brave," she said quietly. "I never realized how hard it must have been." "It was hard," I agreed, "but it was also exciting. I was building something, creating a life that was mine. That's what makes work meaningful, when you're contributing to something larger than yourself." Emma had begun to understand that concept. She started suggesting improvements to the boutique's social media presence, using her generation's digital fluency to help reach new customers. But instead of posting shallow content about fashion trends, she created thoughtful pieces about fashion history, about the stories behind specific pieces, about the craftsmanship that made vintage clothing special. "Look at this," she said, showing me a post she had written about a 1960s mod dress. I researched the designer, the cultural context, even the specific fabric techniques. It got more engagement than any of my personal posts ever did. "Because it has substance," I told her. "People respond to authentic knowledge, to genuine passion for something meaningful." Emma's friends had noticed the change too. Where she had once been valued primarily for her ability to pay for expensive activities, she was now appreciated for her growing expertise in fashion. Several of her friends had asked her for advice about vintage pieces, recognizing that she was developing real knowledge about something they found interesting. "Madison wants me to help her find a vintage dress for prom," Emma told me. She said, "I know more about fashion now than anyone she knows." "Do you want to help her?" I asked. "Yes," Emma said without hesitation. "I think I could find her something really special, something with history and meaning, not just something expensive." That conversation led to Emma's first independent sale, helping Madison find a 1970s Halston dress that was perfect for prom. Emma researched the piece thoroughly, explained its significance, and negotiated a fair price. When Madison wore the dress to prom, she received more compliments than she had ever gotten on any outfit. "Everyone wanted to know where I found it," Madison reported back. "I told them about your boutique, about how Emma is becoming this fashion expert. I think you're going to get some new customers." Emma glowed with pride at this feedback. She was beginning to understand that expertise created its own kind of status, that knowledge and skill were more valuable than money alone. Our personal relationship had healed too. Emma had apologized formally for her behavior at the party, not with the casual dismissiveness of a teenager but with the genuine remorse of someone who understood the depth of her mistake. "I was so ignorant," she said. "I dismissed everything about you without ever bothering to learn who you really are. I'm ashamed of how I acted." "You were young and uninformed," I replied, "but you've learned and grown. That's what matters now." Emma had also reconnected with her Chinese heritage in ways I had never expected. She asked me to teach her some Mandarin phrases again, to show her how to cook traditional dishes, to explain the significance of the jade brooch and other family heirlooms. "I want to understand where I come from," she said. "I want to appreciate the whole story, not just the parts that seemed convenient." The jade brooch had become a symbol of our renewed relationship. Emma asked to wear it to a school presentation about family heritage, proudly explaining its history and significance to her classmates. The same piece she had once found embarrassing now represented her connection to generations of strong women who had overcome challenges to build better lives for their families. "I'm proud to be your granddaughter," she told me after the presentation. "I'm proud of what you've accomplished, proud of our family story, proud to be learning from you." Those words meant more to me than any business award or industry recognition ever had. Emma wasn't just working at my boutique anymore, she was becoming someone I could genuinely respect and admire. Someone who understood that real value came from knowledge, effort, and contribution rather than consumption and privilege. The girl who had once called my clothes cringe now spoke knowledgeably about fashion history to anyone who would listen. The granddaughter who had been embarrassed by her heritage now wore the jade brooch with pride. The teenager who had never connected money to work now understood that every dollar had to be earned through effort and skill. We had both changed through this process. Emma by learning to value things beyond money and status, and me by remembering that love sometimes requires difficult lessons rather than endless indulgence. Our relationship was stronger now than it had ever been, built on mutual respect rather than financial dependence, on shared knowledge rather than unearned privilege. Emma had learned what I had always hoped to teach her, that real wealth comes from understanding your place in a larger story and contributing something meaningful to the world. Emma's first vintage find sits in a place of honor in our 1940s beaded evening gown that she discovered at a small estate sale in Pasadena. The elderly seller had priced it at $50, not recognizing the hand-sewn French beadwork or the couture construction that marked it as a piece worth 20 times that amount. "Look at this," Emma had whispered to me, her voice filled with the excitement of discovery. "The beading pattern, the way the dress is constructed. This isn't just vintage, it's couture, isn't it?" I examined the piece carefully, noting the precise hand stitching, the quality of the materials, the sophisticated draping that could only have been achieved by a master craftsperson. Emma was absolutely right. This was museum-quality work, created during an era when evening gowns were works of art rather than mass-produced commodities. "How much do you think it's worth?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with the thrill of the hunt that I recognized from my own early days in the business. "If it's authentic 1940s couture, probably $1,500 to $2,000, I told her. "But we'll need to research it thoroughly to confirm the attribution." Emma spent the next week diving deep into fashion archives, learning about 1940s designers, studying construction techniques, and building a case for the dress's provenance. She approached the research with the same intensity she had once applied to planning shopping trips, but now her focus was on understanding rather than consuming. "I think it might be Adrian," she announced after days of investigation, showing me photographs of similar pieces from the designer's archives. "The beading pattern matches his work from 1942, and the construction techniques are consistent with his studio's methods." Her research was thorough and convincing. The dress was indeed an Adrian original, created for a Hollywood actress during the golden age of cinema. When we sold it to a collector for $1,800, Emma felt the deep satisfaction that comes from knowledge applied successfully. "I found that," she said, with quiet pride as we completed the transaction. "I recognized its value, I researched its history, I helped connect it with someone who will appreciate it properly." That sale marked Emma's graduation from student to junior partner in the business. She had developed not just knowledge but judgment, not just appreciation but expertise. More importantly, she had learned to find meaning in work that contributed to something larger than herself. 6 months after our confrontation, Emma was working at the boutique by choice rather than obligation. Her trust fund had been fully restored, but she continued coming in regularly, not because she needed the money but because she enjoyed the work. She had discovered that having expertise in something meaningful was more satisfying than having unlimited access to meaningless luxuries. "I think I want to study fashion history in college," she told me one afternoon as we catalogued new acquisitions, "maybe work in museum curation or fashion preservation. I want to do something that matters." The transformation in Emma's social life had been equally profound. Her friend group had evolved to include people who shared her new interests: fashion, students, young designers, people who appreciated creativity and craftsmanship over pure wealth. She still enjoyed nice things, but she had learned to value quality over quantity, meaning over expense. Her relationship with Madison had deepened, too, but in a different way. Instead of bonding over shopping and consumption, they now collaborated on creative projects. Madison was learning photography and often came to the boutique to practice shooting vintage pieces, while Emma wrote about fashion history for the school newspaper. "You're so much more interesting now," Madison told Emma during one of their photo sessions. "But you actually know things. You have expertise. It's really cool." Emma had also begun teaching fashion history to younger students at her school, sharing her growing knowledge with peers who were interested in sustainable fashion and vintage clothing. The same expertise that had once seemed embarrassing to her was now a source of pride and social connection. I love teaching other people about this stuff, Emma confided. When I see someone understand why a vintage piece is special, why craftsmanship matters, why fashion history is important, it feels amazing. Our family relationships had healed as well. Lisa, initially resistant to my tough love approach, had come to appreciate the changes in her daughter. Emma is so much more mature now, she told me. She thinks before she spends. She appreciates what she has. She's genuinely interested in learning about things. I don't know how you did it, but thank you. Even Emma's relationship with her Chinese heritage had blossomed. She asked me to teach her traditional cooking, to share more family stories, to explain cultural traditions she had previously dismissed. The jade brooch was no longer an embarrassing relic but a treasured connection to the women who had come before her. I want to visit China, Emma said one day. I want to see where our family comes from, understand the culture that shaped you. Maybe we could go together. The idea of traveling to China with Emma, of showing her the places that had formed me, filled me with joy. It would complete her education in ways that no amount of boutique work could achieve. As I watch Emma now, working confidently with customers, sharing her knowledge with genuine enthusiasm, treating each vintage piece with the respect it deserves, I feel a deep satisfaction that has nothing to do with money or business success. I have not just taught my granddaughter about fashion history, I have helped her understand that real fulfillment comes from developing expertise, contributing to something meaningful, and respecting the knowledge and sacrifices of those who came before her. The boutique continues to thrive, but now it serves a purpose beyond financial success. It has become a bridge between generations, a place where Emma and I work together as partners rather than simply as grandmother and granddaughter. She brings fresh perspectives and digital skills, while I provide experience and institutional knowledge. Together, we are preserving fashion history and passing it on to others who will appreciate and protect it. Emma's transformation from entitled teenager to knowledgeable young woman proves that the hardest lessons are often the most valuable ones. She learned that money without understanding is meaningless, that privilege without gratitude is hollow, that consumption without contribution is ultimately unsatisfying. But most importantly, she learned that being connected to something larger than yourself, whether it's family history, cultural heritage, or professional expertise, gives life, meaning that no amount of material wealth can provide. The jade brooch still catches the light beautifully when Emma wears it. But now it represents not just family tradition but personal growth, not just cultural heritage but earned wisdom. And when Emma eventually passes it on to her own daughter, she will do so with full understanding of what it represents: the strength, sacrifice, and love of generations of women who worked to build something meaningful for those who would come after them. The education is complete, but the learning continues. Every day brings new discoveries, new challenges, new opportunities to grow in knowledge and wisdom. Emma has learned that this is what makes life rich: not the accumulation of possessions, but the development of understanding, the building of expertise, and the sharing of knowledge with others who are eager to learn. In teaching Emma these lessons, I have rediscovered my own purpose and passion. The boutique is no longer just my business, it is our legacy, a place where fashion history lives and breathes and continues to inspire new generations of people who understand that some things are too beautiful and meaningful to be dismissed as merely cringe. If you've ever felt dismissed by younger family members who don't understand your journey, like this video.